Hello and welcome to another episode of Earth911, Sustainability in Your Ear. I'm Mitch, Ratcliffe, your host. We're back with another innovator interview. We want to talk today about flooding of lowland areas along coasts as sea levels rise. And to do so, we invited James-Renwick. He's the head of the School of Geography, Environment, and Earth Sciences at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. He's also one of the lead authors of the upcoming United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change report. This is one of their major updates of the UN's plans for climate change policy, which will be released in 2021. James, welcome to the show. How are you today?
I'm very well, thanks, Mitch, and thanks very much for inviting me onto the show.
Well, it's a pleasure to have you here because we are very interested in what you study. You cover the impact of glacial melt and rising seas on, amongst other things, affordable homes and low-lying areas like Miami and New York City, which are expected to be flooded. In fact, in one recent report I read from an organization called Climate Central, affordable homes face a 300% greater flooding risk over the next 30 years because they tend to be in low-lying areas. Let me start off with a very basic question. And you study Antarctica. How much ice is in Antarctica, and how much water would it release if it all melted?
That's a great question to start with. It's an almost unimaginable amount of ice, I think. When you think about Antarctica, it's important to differentiate between the West Antarctic, which is the part essentially due south of South America, and the East Antarctic, which is the part that sort of juts out over into the Indian Ocean side. So the West Antarctic holds enough ice to raise sea levels on the order of 4 meters or so, whereas the East Antarctic holds enough ice to raise sea levels by over 50 meters, somewhere between 50 and 60 meters. So if all of the Antarctic ice melted, we'd be talking about total sea level rise of something on the order of 60 meters, which is, a pretty staggering amount.
Just to do a little metric conversion for...
Oh, yes.
So 4 meters is roughly 12 and a half feet. 50 meters, on the other hand, is about 210 feet, if I do my math correctly. Is that what we're talking?
That's exactly right, yeah. That's a lot.
That's a remarkable amount of water. Now, of course, it isn't all going to melt immediately. And probably won't melt in the next few centuries entirely. But you're projecting a lot of increase over the next 30 years. What do you expect sea level to rise to look like in 2050?
Well, sea levels have already risen about a little less than a foot on average globally in the last 150 years. And the expectation is there'll be about that much more sea level rise in the next 40 years or so. How much we get beyond that really depends on what happens with emissions of greenhouse gases. So, the action under the Paris Agreement and so on. If the countries of the world do manage to reduce their emissions of carbon dioxide to zero by 2050 or 2060, mid-century, then we would see not much more than 1.5 degrees of global warming. And that would limit sea level rise to maybe in total about 1 meter, 3 feet. So another couple of feet above where we're at now over the next century or even 2 centuries. That's the best case scenario, I would say. If those pledges are not met up with and we don't cap emissions quickly enough and we let the warming get above, say, 2 degrees globally, 2 degrees centigrade, then we are pretty likely to lock in the melting of big chunks of the West Antarctic ice sheet and parts of the East Antarctic too as well. Like you were saying, it doesn't all melt over a weekend. It takes hundreds of years. But we might be committing the globe to several meters of sea level rise if we let warming get above about 2 degrees Celsius.
I think that's an important point. The idea of committing the planet, and we're buying this reality for our grandchildren if we don't take action today.
That's exactly right, and I wonder about if we get to a point where it's obvious from the observations of what's happening in Antarctica that we know this unstoppable melting has begun, I don't know what that would feel like. We would know that we have committed essentially all future generations to a different map of the world. 3 or 4 metres, like 10 feet of sea level rise would change the coastlines of an awful lot of countries, and the east coast of the US especially would be pretty hard hit. So I really hope we don't go there. I really hope that we can cap emissions quickly and stop the warming at well below 2 degrees. I think this prospect of several metres of sea level rise is one of the strongest arguments for really going hard on emissions reductions.
Do you have a general sense of the financial cost of that kind of sea level rise, what you project over the next 30 years?
Over the next 30 years, or even this century, if we get, somewhere between 1 and 2 feet more sea level rise from where we're at the moment, I'm not sure about the number globally. I know even for a small country like New Zealand, we're talking about billions of dollars of properties and infrastructure near the coast that would be affected. So if you look around the world, I'm sure it's in the trillions of dollars. And I know some of the low-lying places in the US, you already mentioned Florida, some parts of the coastal US and a number of other countries in Asia and so on would be very badly affected. So I'm sure it would be trillions and trillions of dollars, and actually millions of people who would be displaced or would be at least threatened with having to move away.
Well, and I think that it's that potential movement of populations that is probably the scariest part of this scenario, because when you have people moving, you create conflict. Now,
exactly, yeah.
Now, when we let's think about 2050 a little bit, and I've seen projections that up to 37% of Lower Manhattan, which of course in and of itself is trillions of dollars in real estate, be flooded by mid-century. And of course, the city of Miami is already almost underwater at some times of the year when they have king tides. Can you describe what the East Coast would look like with a meter of sea level rise?
That's a really great question. I don't have a map in front of me of what that would look like, but I know that a lot of the low-lying regions in Florida, especially, and parts of the east coast of the US would go underwater like completely every day, and there would be a lot of real estate that would be at risk of damage from coastal inundation. Like right now, we have this problem with what's called sunny day flooding. It can be fine weather, but just with a high tide, water starts coming up through the stormwater system and into the streets in some of the coastal cities up the east coast of the US. So with the kind of rises in sea level projected this century or even the next 30 years, it may not change the actual coastline all that much, but it would put a large amount of the lower lying parts of the eastern US at risk. And I think it's really important to realise that we don't have to wait until a certain city or a certain part of a given state is underwater. I think things start to change much sooner than that. Once enough properties start to become damaged in a storm or roads start to be eaten away, once the infrastructure starts to decay a bit, people are going to get the message and want to move away. And I think we might see movement of people out of some of these at-risk areas up the coast well before they actually go under the waves, as it were. Just one or two adverse events with winter storms and so on could trigger some quite large movements of population. And unfortunately, the way sea level rises, it doesn't rise equally all over the world. We talk about half a metre of sea level rise, 1 or 2 feet. That's the global average. But some parts of the world, the sea level rises only a little bit, and other parts it rises a lot more than the average. And unfortunately, the eastern seaboard of North America is one of the places where the rate of rise of sea level is quite a bit faster than the global average. So, Manhattan, New York, all of the coastal cities along the eastern seaboard and into New Orleans, the Gulf states and Florida are looking especially at risk in the northern hemisphere, actually.
And let's talk a little about affordable housing, because, for instance, in Newark, New Jersey, where I've spent some time, a lot of lower income people live near the water, right down at sea level.
Mm-hmm.
How do you project the equity of the impact, or rather the inequity of the impact? Is this going to hit the poor harder than it hits the wealthy?
Yes, it is. Almost inevitably it is. And that situation with affordable housing in the US is a real microcosm of the whole global situation. The less developed countries, the poorer countries, are the ones that are likely to suffer the most damage and the most adverse effects from climate change, not just sea level rise. And they're the ones that are least able to afford to protect themselves. So climate change has the potential to increase inequalities dramatically, both within countries and across the world.
So let me ask you, let's turn to the question of the Paris Accords, which, of course, you're working on a follow-up report for the UN about. Have the Paris Accords changed the trajectory of climate change yet?
The Paris Accord and those discussions under the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change have changed the conversation at a policy level quite dramatically. We're now 5 years past the actual setting up of that Paris Agreement, and global emissions of greenhouse gases have yet to start declining, which is really worrying. But we are at a point now where the policy conversation, the political conversation around the world has shifted an awful lot from where it was even 5 or 6 years ago. Some of the major emitters, China, Japan, South Korea, and so on, the UK, parts of Europe, are talking about zero carbon by 2050 and big reductions in emissions in the next 10 years. 10 years, which is quite remarkable considering where things were at a decade ago. No country was really talking about that kind of thing, not in those kind of serious terms. So it's a big step forward from a political, psychological point of view even, but the action has yet to really start happening. I know the same story here in New Zealand. We have a law now that says we will get to zero carbon by 2050, but we haven't seen emissions start to reduce yet. That should happen soon. It's got to start happening from the coming year, or we're in real trouble.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point to highlight, that this really is the pivotal year in history when we are going to make or break that 2030 goal. And one of the big challenges here is the difference in the changes that need to be made by wealthier and lower income nations. The nationally determined targets that each nation agrees to contribute to trying to prevent 1.5 degrees centigrade warming vary because of where they are economically. Do you feel like the targets are being adjusted enough by the wealthy countries, which have tended to be the largest emitters, but may not be the largest emitters in the midterm as everybody moves towards net zero? Are they ready to make the additional sacrifice to help get the planet cooling rather than warming?
That's a really important consideration. The mix of who's emitting what is going to change through time, and the US historically has been the largest emitter, and yet is no longer the largest on a real-time basis now. China's overtaken the US on that front. But yeah, in the Paris Agreement, there is this mechanism for developed countries essentially to work harder. So that's written into the text of the Paris Agreement, and all of the countries of the world essentially have signed up to this. So that's the expectation, and the idea that countries will up their ambition over time is a core part of how that's all supposed to work. What we do know is that right now, if you put all of the pledges on the table that have been made by the countries of the world and they were all enacted, then we would still be getting to something more like 3 degrees of warming than below 2 degrees. So we're quite away from where we need to be. What I take heart in is knowing that even a couple of years ago, when you added up the pledges, they got us closer to 4 degrees of warming. We're now down to a little less than 3 degrees of warming. So things are starting to move in the right direction. But that idea that the developed countries should really be working harder as a bit of insurance for some of the developing nations, some of the big developing nations, such as India, for instance, to give them a bit of headroom, because, some of these countries that have not profited from the burning of fossil fuels in the way that some of the richer countries in the world have already, that they have to be given a bit of room to do some of that while they transition to renewable, low-carbon energy. So things, again, are moving in the right direction, but we have a lot of work to do yet. The next COP meeting, which was, the follow-on from the Paris meeting and so on, should have happened last month in the UK. It's been postponed a year because of COVID, and it will be happening in Scotland in 2021. That is the meeting where the countries of the world are really expected to put some serious increases in their ambition on the table. And I'm hopeful that we will actually see that, because as the climate keeps changing and as we see these adverse events happening, it does put a lot of pressure on governments to act. And I think we're starting to see that.
Well, of course, the United States left the Paris Accord just about the day after our presidential election, and we elected a new president. And I know America has not been taking much advice from the rest of the world, but let me ask you, what advice do you have for our incoming president, Joe Biden, with regard to the climate policy he should be putting in place and the commitments he should be making at COP26?
Wow. If I can advise the president-elect directly, I would be telling him.
All of us here think we can. That's the thing. So I'm asking.
Right. Sure. And I think it's absolutely the citizens of any country have a lot of power to influence governments, or they should have. So I've already heard that his plan is to rejoin the Paris Accord the day after he's inaugurated, which, if that's actually enacted, that would be a great thing. It's symbolic, I suppose, if you're in or you're out, but it does carry quite a lot of symbolic weight, political weight, for a country like the US to be actively engaged in the Paris Agreement. So just taking that action would be an excellent step. And beyond that, I think actually the US has a lot of great examples already within states and cities of how emissions can be reduced. And the US as a whole has actually been managing to reduce emissions despite a lack of leadership from the federal government in recent years. So I think taking examples from places like California and actually, the Western Seaboard, Washington, Oregon, and I know a number of the major cities in the US have been able to enact policies that have resulted in emissions reductions. So tightening up standards for vehicle emissions, promoting the uptake of electric vehicles, getting rid of coal-fired power stations and rolling out more renewable infrastructure. All of those things would be good moves and things that could be done fairly quickly, I think. Basically anything that reduces emissions of greenhouse gases, especially carbon dioxide, especially burning fossil fuels, that's going to help the problem. And that's what we have to do. We've got to get to zero emissions to stop the warming. And so any step that can be taken on that front is a good move.
Well, let me ask about one other element of this, of a response to the climate, and that is the idea of carbon removal. Do you think it's time for us to start investing in carbon removal technology? And is that something that should be subsidized by an incoming Biden administration or any national government at this point?
Well, yes. The only carbon removal technology that is known to really work that I'm aware of at the moment is planting trees. So reforestation and afforestation is a good thing. So I'm not sure what the situation is in the US on that front, but tree planting is actually a really good thing to be doing. The technological approaches to carbon dioxide removal, there are a number of potential technologies that are being developed at the moment. There aren't any right now that are available on the scale or that could be rolled out on the scale that you would need globally to really make a difference to carbon dioxide concentrations in the atmosphere. So we don't have anything else that's really in the pipeline at this stage. And the ones that do look promising, would require an awful lot of energy to scale up to the level we'd need to make a serious dent in global concentrations of CO2. So it's a bit of a problem right now, and I think it's not something that we can really bank on. Much better to just turn off the tap of emissions than hope for some kind of technological fix in the future. If something did come along, it would be a complete game changer. It would be wonderful. But we just don't have anything on the table right now.
Well, let's hope that happens. My feeling is that the carbon removal is a little like a moonshot for humanity. It may be a good idea to put some money in that, but to your point, it's much more efficacious today to plant a lot more trees or make a commitment to preserve a third of the wilderness or a third of the planet to wilderness, so that we are simply restoring the Earth's lungs, their ability to remove the CO2.
Exactly.
Now, let me ask, what kind of advice do you have for our listeners about what they can do to start to make this change? We've talked about national policy, but, just the steps in cutting their carbon footprint, is that the most important thing I could do today? Figure out what I'm emitting and try to reduce it?
Well, that is something all of us can do today, yes. And what I like to tell people is that anything that makes a difference makes a difference. If you can reduce your own carbon footprint somehow, then that is a contribution. So by all means, be using public transport more, or if you don't have an electric vehicle and you can afford to buy one, well, think about that. Neighbourhood electricity generation, your own solar panels, all of those things would reduce household and personal carbon emissions, carbon footprint. So those sorts of things are all very good things to be involved in, and restoration of wetlands and wild spaces, another really excellent thing to be doing. I think, though, one of the best things any of us can do is to make a noise, talk about the problem, both amongst ourselves, with your own family and workmates, neighbours and so on, but really be in touch with policymakers, because individuals can certainly make changes to their own way of living that will reduce their own carbon footprint, and that's great. But we need to see changes at the societal level. The whole way the economy works and the way that big business operates has to change. I mean, it really does have to transform to zero carbon energy, and individuals can't do that themselves just by driving a different kind of vehicle or using lower energy light bulbs or whatever. We need to shift the whole system. So making sure that policymakers, our elected officials, know that we care about this and that we want to see change quickly, I think that can be really effective as well. And that could be as simple as sending an email or replying to some kind of petition call, or it could involve actually physically going and talking face to face at the state or federal level, whatever works for people, I guess. But just speaking up, I think, is really important for everybody.
So I just want to close with a question about what can we expect from the UNIPCC, the International Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, in 2021?
Well, these IPCC reports are stock takes of the science that are done every few years. And there's been a lot of development of the science in the last 5 or 6 years. We have had some IPCC reports quite recently, the so-called special reports, the one on 1.5 degrees of warming and on sea level rise and so on. But this next report coming out in 2021 is the big one, I guess. It surveys all of the science, all of the impacts, and all of the approaches to solving the problem. So I think some of the things that have come out recently that are worrying. I can't think of a lot of good news that's going to be in this report. The models that we use to simulate and project the future are getting better all the time. Of course, there's a lot of effort goes into those. And a number of the newest climate models that are used for this IPCC report show more rapid warming for an increase in carbon dioxide than the previous generations of models have shown. And I think a lot of that comes down to better simulation of clouds. Cloud effects have always been one of the major sources of uncertainty. And as we improve our understanding, what we're seeing is that cloudiness will change in a way that will actually increase the warming rather than decrease it. So we're seeing now the so-called climate sensitivity, that is, how much does the globe warm if you double carbon dioxide concentrations. That's gone from about 3 degrees, which has been the number for 40 years or more, and it's sort of inched up a bit to more like 3.5 degrees. And the very low sensitivities, like less than 2 degrees of warming for a doubling of CO2, are looking virtually impossible. So it's very likely that the kind of rapid warming we're seeing at the moment actually is likely to continue into the future. So that's a concern. And then this report that comes out in a matter of months will say that 1.5 degrees of warming, it's virtually baked in already, unless something very drastic happens in the next couple of years. So we are seeing rapid warming. We will see at least 1.5 degrees, I think, and we will see some of these thresholds crossed. The melting of the West Antarctic is maybe a little way away, but there's a lot of concern around the Amazon rainforest, and the dieback of that rainforest turning into a savanna kind of state is possible. It's happened in the past, apparently. The Gulf Stream has been slowing down and is unlikely to completely switch off, but it is likely to slow further, and that changes the whole distribution of how heat is transported into the high latitudes, and it would have regional effects on Western Europe and the east coast of North America. Maybe not drastic, but regionally it could lead to some local effects on rainfall and temperature and so on. Arctic sea ice, it's been really hit hard, and quite likely that the report will talk about getting to an ice-free state in summer in the Arctic over the next 30 or 40 years, permafrost thawing and so on. I mean, all of the things that have been part of the scientific understanding for a very long time we'll hear about again, but everything is ramping up and intensifying. Extreme events are on the rise and so on. So this report will be a really excellent summary of all of that. In a way, it won't be saying anything that's terribly new, but that's important. That the scientific understanding we've had for quite a long time now really is solid, and this new report will underline that.
Yeah, I think that's the key idea, is that our scientific understanding is getting increasingly higher resolution. And the predictive power of climate science has been proven repeatedly, even if it's a little fuzzy.
Correct, yeah. I mean, nothing's ever certain in any science. And predicting the future is always hard, as a lot of people have said. But the uncertainties around climate change, the biggest ones are knowing what the global community will do with emissions of greenhouse gases. It's not so much we don't understand what the climate's doing, it's how much harder are we going to push on the climate before we stop doing this experiment. So we know if there's 1 degree of warming, 2 degrees of warming, 3 degrees of warming, what the pattern of change in temperature and rainfall and so on will be, and sea level. The big question is how much further are we going to go, and how much more damage are we going to do before we stop?
Well, james-renwick, I want to thank you for joining and talking with us. On the one hand, that was an incredibly depressing conversation. On the other, I think it is really important that we understand that we do understand the systems we're dealing with and better all the time. And I'd love to have you come back and talk about where all that water goes in extreme weather events in the future. But
sure.
Thank you very much for spending time with us now.
My pleasure. Thank you, Mitch.
Well, folks, that was James Renwick. He's the head of the School of Geography, Environment, and Earth Sciences at Victoria University in Wellington, New Zealand. And follow the UNIPCC report when it comes out. Of course, Earth911 will tell you all about it as well. But It is so important that all of us understand what we are doing to our planet. This is Earth 911, Sustainability in Your Ear. We'll be back with another interview soon. And in the meantime, folks, take a moment and share this podcast with your friends. Let's get the word out. And remember, sustainability is a team sport, so let's pull together. And take care of yourself, take care of one another, and take care of the planet. We'll be back soon.